Good evening, ladies. So you'll notice if you've looked at the table of contents, or you probably even noticed this week, that this study of Luke is not running necessarily chronologically, but more thematically. Dr. Miller has highlighted certain themes that he will be focusing on each week. And because of that, this week's study was focused on what scholars call the Sermon on the Plain. It's the much shorter version in Luke of what's called the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel. And that begins in chapter 6, verse 20. And so, because of that, Dr. Miller did not look at the first half of chapter 6. So, I thought it might be a good idea tonight for us to take a look at Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 19, to see how those verses set up the Sermon on the Mount and provide another layer of lens for reading the Sermon on the Mount. Excuse me, I have a companion here for this. So, if we look at Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 19, what we see, and this is pulling from the end of chapter 5 into chapter 6, is there's this continued conflict, this continued questioning of Jesus by the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious leaders. And every one of those conflicts really boils down to who's getting it right, who has the clear and accurate understanding of what God's will is for his worshipers. Is it the scribes and the Pharisees, and therefore Jesus is scandalously wrong? Or is it Jesus who has it right, and therefore the scribes and the Pharisees are tragically wrong? And that's the question that moves us toward the Sermon on the Mount, or the Sermon on the Plain, as we call it in Luke's Gospel. And really, if you read those controversies at the end of chapter 5, at the beginning of chapter 6, all the, particularly the Sabbath controversies, you see this point of contrast. For the religious leaders, the Sabbath is a holy thing, but it is holy because of rules. That's the heart of the Sabbath. You do these things, you don't do these things. And that is the sum total for them of what makes the Sabbath holy. And remember, the Sabbath was one of the things that distinguished the Jews, God's people, from non-Jews or Gentiles. And so this was a really important matter. But for these religious leaders, the heart of the Sabbath was mechanical, we might say. Check the list. Do this, don't do that. And there was very little focus on human need or human realities. Whereas for Jesus, the Sabbath, the heart of what made it holy, was compassionate care for human beings. Take a look at chapter 6, verse 5, where Jesus kind of stakes his claim on the Sabbath. And he says, the Son of Man, in other words, referring to himself, is Lord of the Sabbath. So Jesus gets to be the one who defines what Sabbath looks like and what makes it holy. And then in verse 9, he asks them a question, and you can almost hear the pain in his voice as he asks these religious leaders. I ask you, he says, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save life or to destroy it? And the obvious answer to that question is the heart of the Sabbath is doing good and saving life. And that's what Jesus then goes on to demonstrate as he engages with the crowds. Verses 18 and 19, we see that Jesus' ministry among the crowds is summed up as healing and freedom, as doing good and bringing life to people who were in desperate need of it. So that then sets us up for the Sermon on the Plain. And the rest of chapter 6, beginning at verse 20, is Jesus drawing a picture of what true religion looks like, of what the real good life looks like, of what it means to live into the ethos and the spirit and the intent of the law as it was given in the Old Testament scripture. This is Jesus saying, this is what it looks like to live well, to walk humbly with your God, to love mercy, to do justice, and to look like citizens of the kingdom. This is what it looks like to bear the family resemblance. And so in chapter 6, Jesus is staking his claim on his authority to determine and to define what the good life is, and on his authority to express that for us. So I pray that you'll go back and read the Sermon on the Plain, the second half of Luke 6, with this set of lenses in mind, and think about, how does your understanding and practice of the good life align with what Jesus portrays in Luke chapter 6? God bless you.